All right, I'm here to talk to you about democracy. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about democracy in the United States, democracy around the world, but specifically what's going on in Chile right now, because I find it really exciting. Now, I give a lot of talk about democracies, quite frequently, and there's one common theme in all of these democracies. Things are not going well when it comes to democracy. And this shouldn't be all that surprising. Like a few examples here. 74% of American voters say that democracy is under threat. 7 in 10 Americans say that the whole democratic experiment could chance fail. We have one major political party where a majority in that party think that the 2020 election was stolen. That's a big deal. You have 60% of Americans who go to vote this Tuesday are going to have an election denier on the ballot. And it's thought that 189 of them might even win. Right, so we start to think about these democratic dynamics and the troubling elements of them. We've seen a rise in political violence, and there's expectations that violence is going to increase after the midterm election. Voter suppression, conversations taking place all over the country where it's becoming more and more difficult to vote. We can step back and think about the Freedom House data, which breaks down a democracy in America, and we've seen an 11-point decline in democracy over the last decade. We were an A democracy, and now we're kind of like a B- democracy, which isn't very good. We can think about globally. It's not just the United States that's dealing with this. This is an issue that's happening around the world as well. And this is from the Freedom House data looking at democracy around the world. And what's really powerful around this is that only 20% of the world's population currently lives in a political system that's deemed to be free. 80% of the world lives in a partly free or not free political system. Only 20% of humanity live in free political systems. None of that is good news. It keeps me up at night. It causes me to give talks about democracy and to scare people, right? But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk to you about something that excites me about democracy, something that gives me hope about democracy, and that something is Chile. The country Chile, not the delicious meal Chile, right? I know these are easy things to get confused. And over the last couple of years, Chile has gone through a dramatic constitutional reform process. They came up with a new constitution. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. In September, they voted on whether to keep or reject the Constitution, and they voted to reject it. 60-40. It was not good. But I still remain optimistic. I still remain excited. And what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes or so is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that process, what happened, and why I think it offers a great deal of hope for us as we think about the future of democracy. Now, any of you who've been to Chile, it's a wonderful place. Beautiful, beautiful landscapes, mountains, oceans, all of that. The food is fantastic. They put mayonnaise on their hot dogs, which I know doesn't sound good, but it's delightful. Again, wonderful, wonderful place. The people are fantastic, but it's had a troubled political history. And much of that trouble stems or started with Augusto Pinochet, a military dictator who came to power in 1974, and he was in power until 1990. He came to power through a military coup. So men with guns showed up and got rid of the democracy. Interestingly, the United States government supported Pinochet in that effort to tumble and end the Chilean democracy. Here's a picture of Henry Kissinger and Augusto Pinochet shaking hands a couple years after the democracy was killed. So the U.S. has a bit of a dirty hands here. Augusto Pinochet quickly eliminated the democracy. He implemented a brutal regime. Roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people were killed during his tenure for speaking out and against the regime. It created a legacy in Chile. When you're traveling in Chile, you still see references and pictures to Salvador Allende, the previous democratic president who was removed and ultimately killed because of the Pinochet network. And when you travel there, you still see the military everywhere. I'm going to show you a picture. This is a picture of me in Chile well after all the trouble. So this was when democracy returned and things were fine. And my good buddy he says, go stand next to those military officials and I'll get a picture of you. And you can see from my face, I was a little worried. You know, is this the end of Muck? I wasn't sure. I was fine. But again, this legacy of Pinochet is powerful, and it hovers over everything. So he's in power from 74 to 1990. In 1980, Augusto Pinochet reinstitutes or creates his own constitution. And it is widely seen as one of the most market-friendly, neoliberal constitutions in the world. It's actually still the constitution in place now because the new one failed. And what's really interesting about that is Pinochet was not a Democrat. He did not believe in political rights or democratic rights, but he did believe in the market and an open market. And so what happens? Well, Pinochet begins this neoliberal model, and it works. It generates tremendous amount of economic wealth. Chile starts to skyrocket economically. It's held up as a model. In 1990, when Pinochet is forced out and democracy returns, it continues to do well economically. It generates this just tremendous amount of economic growth and development. It became the star in circles talking about where were success cases. A lot of people were really excited. But it also did the other thing that free markets do, which is it created inequality. So Chile created a tremendous amount of economic growth, but inequality got worse and worse and worse. And right now, Chile is one of the most inequitable societies around the world right now. So economic growth, but also massive inequality that it continues to struggle with today. All right, let's fast forward to 2019. In 2019, the government, again, the Democratic government, raises the rates on transit, basically buses and subways, by 30 pesos. For US dollars, it's like 3 or 4 cents. And I'm sure the government thought nobody's going to really care, it's not that much. You know who got pissed off? Students. Students were angry. Students start protesting. They start showing up in the streets. They're jumping over the rail to take the subway for free, right? They begin this protest movement pushing back. So it begins with the students, but then it quickly spreads. Other parts of the society say, this isn't fair. It's not equitable. We're already struggling, right? So the protest movement starts to begin. And what happens? The government sees this, and they say, we got to stop this. So they rescind it. They pull back the 30 peso increase in bus and subway fares. But it was already too late. The protest movement had grown. And what we see here, all these signs start popping up. It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. So the protest movement has had these signs everywhere. And you may be wondering, what does that mean? It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. Well, it had been roughly 30 years since Pinochet had been in power. And so the public is looking around and saying to its democratically elected government, you had 30 years to address inequality, 30 years to address the high healthcare costs, 30 years to address educational costs, 30 years to address the economic suffering that the Chilean people have felt, and you haven't fixed it. And so again, that gets some currency, and more people start showing up. Eventually, the protests become massive, where it felt like literally everybody in Chile was protesting its democratic government. Very, very inspiring. So what happens? The government says, okay, let's think about reform. And so they put a referendum out there. They say to the people, let's ask them if they want to change the Constitution. The referendum had 2 questions. I like this. Do you want a new Constitution? 78% of the Chilean population said yes. Think about that. Nearly 80% of the population said, yes, we want new reform. Second question, who should write it? So one option was popularly elected delegates. This was basically citizens, the people. We would elect the people, and they would write the Constitution. Or the other option was a mix of the people and members of Congress. Well, what did they decide? They wanted the people. They wanted the people to write this new Constitution. And that's what happens. So now when this happens, they say we want gender parity in the writing of this new Constitution. So they elected 155 delegates, 77 women, 78 men. And they wrote this new document. Very, very exciting stuff. I know you're wondering, what's in the document? All right, let's look at it. So here's the cover page. I will tell you, it's long. There are 388 articles in this Constitution. That's a long Constitution. Let's talk a little bit about what's in it. The first cause, Article 1, says that Chile is a plurinational and intercultural state. Plurinational. What does that mean? It is a state made up of many different nations, different entities, and that they can coexist all in one space. Primarily, it's thinking about indigenous rights. This is the #1 article in this new Constitution to say indigenous rights, the people that were here before we all came in, have a right, should have a voice. They should be included in the political process. Indigenous rights are throughout this document. Very, very exciting. What else is in it? Gender parity in government and in all public-private entities, all across the board. Every government official, every institution is going to have gender parity. What else is in there? LGBTQ rights codified in the document. We're not interpreting it in different ways. It's in there specifically. What else? Ensured access, universal access to education, healthcare, water, and housing. Animal rights. Animal rights, right? You think about this is a human constitution, which is also thinking about the rights of animals, also thinking about digital rights. And you're probably going, what are digital rights? Your digital footprint. When you're online, right, you actually have a right to own that material. Like, I don't think about that. I think it's either the Facebook or the Twitter or Google. They own my material. But no, this is a constitution saying that no, individuals have a right to their own digital rights. Ensures the right to make autonomous, informed decisions about one's own body, including reproduction. Again, codified in the document itself. What else do we see? Granted constitutional rights to nature and the environment. Animal rights, women's rights, environmental rights. Again, discussed and detailed in the document. It's one of the more impressive things. Specifically, it says that fighting climate change is a state obligation. You have to be thinking about this, and all aspects of your government need to be focused on addressing climate change. Again, this is only a little bit of it. 388 is a lot of articles. So when you step back, a couple things jump out at you. This is without doubt the most progressive constitution in the history of the world. I mean, think about all the elements that are in there. And it came from the people. People ran for office, they sat in a room, and they said, what do we want in a constitution? And when they did that, this is what happens. Now, this is probably also why it was voted down. It was probably too much too quickly, right? We like change, but we don't like a lot of change, right? So this was part of the reason that it was easy to defeat, because you could attack some of the principles. But again, it is really stunning to see that progressive of a constitution that organically came from the people. The other thing that strikes me about this is that this is a constitution, arguably the only constitution in the world, that is thinking about problems for the 21st century. It's thinking about the world that we're entering, and how do we create a political system that can address those problems? Thinking about gender, thinking about identity, thinking about climate change, thinking about these problems. How do we create a political system that is well-functioned to address those problems? It's thinking forward. And I think that's also revolutionary as well. Because, I mean, as an example, think about the United States political system. How do we grapple with problems of the 21st century? I'll tell you what we do. We ask what the Founding Fathers would do, right? So we want to figure out, okay, how do we think about global pandemics? What do we think about climate change? What do we think about women's rights, LGBTQ rights? How do we think about those? Let's think about what the Founding Fathers do. Right? That's what we do. That's how we go back and we say, well, what do they think about things, right? I mean, who's the digital, what is the gram, right? I mean, our approach in the United States is to look backwards. We think that if we just read the Constitution one more time, if we understand what Madison really meant, or if we read the Federalist Papers just one more time from a different perspective, we're going to reveal and learn, about how to handle problems in the 21st century. A very, very different approach. I mean, even just this last week, the Supreme Court was dealing with issues about whether race should be part of college applications. What did they do? They went back and they said, what do the Founding Fathers think about this? It's about the original and the intent and the textualists. We look back. Same thing as we think about, Dobbs and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That was a conversation about what was originally intended. What did these Founding Fathers mean? I'm not so sure it's useful to look back when we're trying to solve problems in our future. So this was what makes me excited about the way that Chile is approaching this. Now, I know this is a hard thing to think about, right? We love our Founding Fathers. We look up to them. We watch TV shows on them, right? It's okay to say they didn't have all the answers, and in fact, some of the Founding Fathers themselves agreed to that. So here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, "I'm not an advocate for frequent change in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times." I think Thomas Jefferson would dig what's going on in Chile right now. I think he would be excited. So as we think about the change and what's happening in Chile and these developments, I think it's useful to step back and say, okay, what are the lessons that we draw from this? And I think one of them is that change can happen. Change is difficult. Political change is particularly difficult. but at times we become so overwhelmed that we don't do it. Change is possible. Let's think about Chile. In 2019, protests began. In 2020, there was a referendum to change the Constitution. In 2021, they proposed a new Constitution, and in 2022, they voted it down. That's a lot to do in 3 years. And I think it's pretty extraordinary what individuals and what humans can do when given the opportunity. So as I think about what's happening in Chile and why it excites me, why it gives me hope, is that I think some of those same pathways are available to us in the United States. We could think about political reform, and not just at the margins, dramatic political reform. And I think down the road we'd be better for it. Because even though Chile voted down its constitution, they're not done with that. They're going to pass a new constitution. And that new constitution is going to have some of the same elements that I just showed you. And I think it's going to be a better place because of that. So again, we as Americans, as we think about change and how we address that, especially with an election coming up, I think we should try to all be a little bit like Chileans and think about more radical change. Thank you.